Her hands tremble violently as she pours whiskey for the ruthless strangers at her remote desert tavern. Every soul in Copper Canyon treats Vivian Harlow with cautious respect, a widow whose uncontrollable shaking began after burying her husband. Beneath the merciless sun, what these outlaws don't realize is that behind those quivering fingers and downcast eyes lies a past steeped in military precision and classified operations. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Before she was Vivian Harlow, grieving widow and tavern owner, she was Lieutenant Vivian Quicksilver Hayes, the Army's most lethal sniper with confirmed eliminations across 3 war zones. Now, as the infamous Hawkins gang terrorizes this forgotten frontier town, they've made one fatal error. They've mistaken her trembling hands for weakness, never suspecting those same shaking fingers become unnaturally still the moment she raps them around the stock of a rifle. The relentless Arizona sun beat down on the parched earth of Copper Canyon, its heat rising in visible waves from the dusty main street that cut through the heart of this struggling frontier settlement. At high noon, most townsfolk retreated indoors, seeking whatever meager shade they could find against the scorching summer temperatures. Only the occasional tumbleweed dared to move through the deserted thoroughfare, driven by a hot wind that offered no relief. On the eastern edge of town, where civilization gave way to the vast, unforgiving desert, stood Harlow's Rest, a weathered wooden tavern with a sloped porch and faded sign that creaked on rusted chains whenever the wind blew. The building had witnessed decades of Copper Canyon's boom and bust cycle, from the copper mining surge that gave the town its name to the slow decline that followed when the veins ran dry. It remained one of the few businesses still operating in a town dying of thirst, both literal and economic. Inside, Vivian Harlow moved methodically through her afternoon routine, wiping down the bar's scarred wooden surface with practiced circular motions. At 46, her once auburn hair was now streaked with silver, pulled back in a simple braid that emphasized the sharp angles of her face and the permanent crease between her brows. She was lean and wiry, though something in her posture, a deliberate way of holding herself, shoulders slightly hunched forward, gave customers the impression of fragility. The tremor in her hands was most noticeable when she arranged glasses. On the shelf behind the bar, the delicate clink of glass against glass betraying her condition. It was always worse in the afternoon heat, when the temperature inside the tavern climbed, despite the shuttered windows and the ceiling fans spinning lazily overhead. At least, that's what she told the concerned locals who often tried to help. "Just the heat getting into these old bones," she would say with a tight smile that never reached her eyes. The truth, like most things about Vivian Harlow, was considerably more complicated. The tavern stood empty this afternoon, chairs still upturned on tables from the morning's sweeping. Vivian paused at the window, peering through a gap in the shutters toward the western road that led into town. Her eyes, an unusual shade of grey that appeared almost silver in certain light, scanned the horizon with an awareness that seemed at odds with her supposedly simple life. 3 years she'd been in Copper Canyon. 3 years of carefully constructed routines. 3 years of being exactly what everyone expected, a widow finding solace in hard work, in serving others, in the predictable rhythms of running a small-town establishment. 3 years of relative peace. The sound of hoofbeats on packed earth broke her reverie. Horses approached from the west, 5 riders moving at a steady pace that raised dust clouds visible from a distance. Vivian's fingers tightened almost imperceptibly. Around the rag in her hand, the fabric suddenly motionless, despite the tremor that had been present moments before. She recognized the riders, of course. They had passed through the county twice in the past month, leaving a trail of looted shops and frightened townsfolk in their wake. The Hawkins gang had been moving systematically through the Arizona territory, targeting small towns with limited law enforcement. Copper Canyon, with its aging sheriff and single deputy, was precisely the kind of vulnerable community they preferred. As the riders drew closer, distinctive features became apparent. At the front rode a tall man on a chestnut stallion, his broad-brimmed hat pulled low against the sun, but not quite concealing sharp features and cold, calculating eyes. Thomas Hawkins himself, former Confederate officer turned outlaw, now leader of the most notorious gang in the territory. Beside him rode his younger brother James, a man with a quick smile that belied his reputation for sudden, unpredictable violence. The remaining three were Hawkins' loyal enforcers, the massive Blackwell with his distinctive red beard, silent, Rodriguez with his twin revolvers, and the wiry, nervous Carson who served as their scout. Together, they had terrorized settlements across 3 territories, always staying one step ahead of federal marshals. Vivian set down her cloth, noticed the slight tremor had returned to her hands, and took a measured breath. She moved to the bar, adjusted her apron, and waited as the sound of boots on her porch announced their arrival. The door swung open, bringing with it a blast of heat and the distinctive smell of dust, horse, and gun oil. Well now, looks like we found ourselves the only watering hole in this dried-up excuse for a town, Hawkins announced, filling the doorway with his tall frame. His voice carried the lingering traces of Virginia plantation aristocracy, incongruous against his trail-worn appearance. "We're not officially open until 4, Vivian said, her voice soft but carrying across the empty tavern. The tremor in her hands became more pronounced as she reached for glasses beneath the counter. "But I can make an exception for thirsty travelers. Water's free. Whiskey will cost you." Thomas Hawkins approached the bar with unhurried confidence, his spurs jingling. With each step on the wooden floor, his men spread out behind him, instinctively positioning themselves with tactical precision. James near the window, Blackwell by the door, Rodriguez and Carson covering the room's corners. 5 whiskeys, Hawkins said, dropping coins on the bar with a deliberate clatter. "An information. I'm looking for a man named Fletcher, Marshal William Fletcher. Word is he passed through these parts recently." Vivian's hands trembled visibly as she poured amber liquid into 5 glasses, the bottle clinking against the rims. "Sheriff Daniels handles law enforcement questions," she replied without elaboration, sliding the drinks across the bar. "His office is 2 buildings down from the general store." James Hawkins snickered, downing his whiskey in a single swallow. "We'll be having words with your sheriff soon enough, ma'am. Real interesting conversation, I expect." Vivian kept her expression neutral, but her mind was already calculating, assessing. The Hawkins gang wasn't just passing through. The mention of Marshal Fletcher confirmed her suspicions. They were being pursued, perhaps more closely than usual, and had chosen Copper Canyon not just as a target, but as a temporary hideout. "You have rooms available in this establishment?" Thomas asked, sipping his whiskey with surprising refinement. 3 upstairs, Vivian answered, her trembling hands now clasped before her. $10 each per night, includes breakfast and dinner. "We'll take them all," Hawkins said, placing additional money on the counter. "My men and I find ourselves in need of accommodations while we conduct business in your charming community." The threat beneath the courtesy was unmistakable. Copper Canyon was about to become the Hawkins gang's newest conquest, with Harlow's Rest as their base of operations. Vivian nodded, taking the money with shaking fingers. "I'll prepare the rooms," she said, her voice betraying nothing of the rapid strategic assessment occurring behind her carefully neutral expression. "Much obliged, Mrs. Hawkins let the question hang in the air. "Harlow, Vivian Harlow." "Widow Harlow, I presume?" he asked, nodding toward the black band she still wore on her left wrist. "Yes, 3 years now." Blackwell, the massive red-bearded man, laughed from his position by the door. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us now. Back to the story. "Explains the shakes," he said, making a crude drinking motion with his hand. "Seen it before. Widows turn to the bottle when the loneliness gets too much." Vivian allowed her hands to tremble more noticeably as she collected the empty glasses. "A nerve condition," she corrected quietly. "My husband's passing was difficult." "My condolences," Thomas said, though his cold eyes held no sympathy. "What happened to the fortunate Mr. Harlow?" "Mining accident," she replied, the lie practiced and smooth after 3 years. "Tunnel collapse in the North Ridge. 8 men lost that day." Hawkins studied her face, searching for something in her downcast expression. "Dangerous country, Arizona Territory. A woman alone faces many hazards." "I manage," Vivian said simply. "Sheriff." Martin Daniels had just finished his midday meal at Clara's cafe when Vivian entered through the back door. At 67, Daniels had served as Copper Canyon sheriff for nearly 15 years, his weathered face and silver mustache as much. A fixture of the town as the copper mine that had given it its name. He looked up from his coffee, his usual friendly smile fading as he caught the deliberate purpose in Vivian's normally hesitant movements. "Afternoon, Viv," he said, gesturing to the chair across from him. "Something troubling you?" Vivian slid into the seat, her hands clasped tightly in her lap to control their movement. "We have visitors, Martin. The Hawkins gang just rode into town." Sheriff Daniels set down his coffee cup, his expression darkening immediately. "Thomas Hawkins? You're certain?" Vivian nodded. "They've taken all 3 rooms at my place. They're asking about Marshal Fletcher." The sheriff's weathered face creased with concern. "Fletcher passed through last week tracking them. Said they hit Silver Springs hard. 2 men dead in the bank robbery, including the teller." "They're not just passing through," Vivian said quietly, her eyes meeting the sheriff's, with an intensity that momentarily belied her usual demeanor. "They're setting up here, using the town as a hideout." Daniels sighed heavily, his hand unconsciously moving to rest on his holstered revolver. "Damn. With Deputy Collins out at the Peterson Ranch until tomorrow, I'm short-handed." He studied Vivian's face, noting the unusual steadiness in her gaze that contrasted sharply with her trembling hands. "Maybe you should stay with Clara for a few days, Viv. Having those men under your roof isn't safe." "I'll be fine," Vivian replied with quiet certainty. "Better to keep them contained where we can watch them. If they take over the tavern anyway, we lose our best vantage point in town." The sheriff gave her a curious look. For a moment, there was something in Vivian Harlow's expression he'd never seen before. A hardness, a calculation that seemed out of place in the gentle widow he'd known for 3 years. "Viv, these aren't just troublemakers. The Hawkins gang has killed lawmen across 2 territories. They're dangerous men." She withdrew her hand, and just like that, the tremor returned. The momentary glimpse of something else in her demeanor vanished, replaced by the familiar, slightly stooped posture of the town's resident widow. "You're right, of course," she said, her voice soft again. "I'm just worried about the tavern. It's all I have." Daniel's expression softened. "Don't you worry. I won't. Let anything happen to you or your place. You've been through enough already." If only he knew, Vivian thought, as she walked back toward Harlow's Rest. As she moved down the dusty main street, Vivian allowed herself to observe the town with different eyes than those of the tavern keeper she pretended to be. Copper Canyon was vulnerable in many ways. Isolated, with minimal law enforcement, a community that had already suffered economic hardship from the failing mines. Easy pickings for someone like the Hawkins gang, she noted James Hawkins and Carson emerging from the general store, their manner deceptively casual as they surveyed the town's layout. Through the window, she could see Thomas deep in conversation with Harold Williams, the bank manager, whose expression reflected growing concern. Rodriguez stood nearby, his stance suggesting intimidation rather than conversation. Vivian continued walking, never breaking stride or showing any particular interest in the scene, but she was logging every detail, every nuance. By the time she reached her tavern, the pieces were beginning to fall into place. The Hawkins gang wasn't just looking for temporary shelter from pursuing lawmen, they were preparing for something bigger. She entered through the kitchen door, grateful for the momentary solitude. Her right hand trembled as she poured herself a glass of water, but her mind was crystal clear, processing information with a precision she had deliberately suppressed for 3 years. The Hawkins gang's presence changed everything. They threatened not just her carefully constructed cover identity, but the community that had unwittingly provided her sanctuary. Sheriff Daniels, for all his experience and courage, was outmatched and outgunned. Deputy Collins was young and inexperienced. The townspeople were ordinary civilians, unprepared for the calculated violence that men like Thomas Hawkins could unleash. 3 years ago, after the bloodbath in Kabul that had left her the sole survivor of her unit, Lieutenant Vivian Hayes had made a choice. Rather than accept a desk position training new recruits, rather than face the questions about how she alone had survived when 7 other elite soldiers had died, she had disappeared. The army had eventually declared her dead, another casualty of an operation that remained classified. Vivian Harlow had emerged 6 months later, a widow with a tragic past and trembling hands that kept people from looking too closely, from asking too many questions. She had chosen Copper Canyon precisely because it was remote, unimportant, forgotten by most of the territory's authorities. A place where a woman with secrets could disappear. Now those secrets might be the only thing standing between this town and destruction. Outside, the sun began its slow descent toward the western mountains, painting the desert in golden light. In a few hours, locals would begin arriving for their evening drinks, miners coming off shift, ranch hands from the surrounding properties, the blacksmith and the cobbler and the schoolteacher. Ordinary people who had accepted Vivian's Trembling, hands without question, who respected her desire for quiet, who never pushed past the boundaries she had so carefully established. She couldn't allow the Hawkins gang to harm them. She wouldn't. Vivian moved to the small storage room behind the kitchen, unlocking a heavy trapdoor concealed beneath old grain sacks. The cellar below was cool and dry, its dirt floor packed hard from years of use. In the farthest corner, behind, shelves of preserved foods and liquor reserves, she knelt beside what appeared to be a simple wooden crate. Her hands, trembling visibly in the lantern light, worked the hidden latches with practiced ease. Inside, wrapped carefully in oiled cloth, lay the remnants of another life, a precision sharps rifle, disassembled but immaculately maintained. 2 Colt revolvers with custom grips that fit her hands perfectly, boxes of ammunition, a military issue, knife with its distinctive carbon steel blade, the tools of Lieutenant Vivian Hayes, the woman who had disappeared from official records 3 years ago. Her hands hovered over the weapons, the tremor suddenly noticeably absent. With the precision of someone who had performed this action countless times, she began to assemble the Sharps rifle, each component clicking into place with satisfying certainty. Only when she set it aside and closed the crate did the tremor return, as if her body remembered which role it was currently playing. Vivian hadn't touched these weapons since arriving in Copper Canyon. She'd hoped never to need them again. But hope, she had learned long ago through blood and loss, was a luxury rarely afforded to people with her particular set of skills. As she climbed the ladder back to the storage room, the weight of her decision settled across her shoulders. For 3 years, she had been Vivian Harlow, widow and tavern keeper. She had buried her past along with the ghosts that haunted it. She had found, if not peace, then at least a kind of quiet existence in this desert town. But the arrival of the Hawkins gang changed everything. They had brought danger to the doorstep of the place she now called home, threatening people who had shown her nothing but kindness. Standing in her darkened kitchen, Vivian looked out the window toward the main street of Copper Canyon. The last rays of sunlight caught the weathered buildings, turning the faded wood to gold. It was beautiful in its rough, uncompromising way. Everything her previous life had not been. For the first time in 3 years, Vivian allowed herself to remember exactly who she had been before becoming the widow Harlow. Before the trembling hands that everyone attributed to grief, but were actually the result of nerve damage from a shrapnel wound in Afghanistan. Before she had faked her death rather than face questions about the mission that had gone catastrophically wrong. Lieutenant Vivian Quicksilver Hayes had been a ghost for 3 years, but ghosts sometimes had a way of returning when they were needed most. In the quiet of her kitchen, Vivian made coffee with hands that shook visibly. By morning, the Hawkins gang would begin their systematic takeover of Copper Canyon. They would expect to find a collection of simple townspeople, easy to intimidate, easy to control. What they would never expect was that the trembling widow who served them whiskey had once been among the deadliest snipers in the United States Army. They would never suspect that those shaking hands had, in another life, remained perfectly steady while eliminating high-value targets at distances other sharpshooters considered impossible. They would never imagine that her quiet watchfulness masked a tactical mind that had orchestrated operations across 3 war zones. The Hawkins gang had chosen Copper Canyon because it seemed vulnerable, isolated, undermanned, and defenseless. They had made a grave miscalculation. Vivian Harlow sat down her coffee cup, noticed the tremor in her hands, and smiled for the first time in 3 years. The tremor was no longer her weakness. It was her perfect disguise. The saloon doors swung, open at precisely 6 o'clock, admitting the evening's first wave of thirsty patrons. Miners with copper dust still embedded in the creases of their weathered hands, ranch hands smelling of horse and leather. The blacksmith with forearms like tree trunks and burns scattered across his apron. These were Vivian's regulars, hard-working, men who had accepted her as one of their own, despite her trembling hands and reticent nature. Tonight, however, a palpable tension charged the atmosphere as they entered. Word of the Hawkins gang's arrival had spread through Copper Canyon faster than a desert wildfire. Conversations hushed as the men noticed the 5 strangers occupying the corner table, boots propped carelessly on chairs, whiskey bottles already half empty. Thomas Hawkins observed the locals with the calculated assessment of a predator identifying potential threats or easy prey. His brother James made a show of cleaning his fingernails with a wicked-looking knife, the blade catching the lamplight with each deliberate movement. Blackwell, Rodriguez, and Carson had positioned themselves for optimal coverage of the room, a military-style formation that didn't escape Vivian's notice. She moved between tables with practiced efficiency, pouring drinks and delivering plates of stew with hands that trembled more pronouncedly under the weight of watchful eyes. The tremor that had once been a cause for shame had become her greatest asset, a perfect disguise that led dangerous men to underestimate her completely. "Evening, Hank," she said softly to the lead miner as she set down his usual whiskey. "Copper. Still running thin," Hank nodded grimly, his eyes darting toward the Hawkins table. "Might be shutting down the east shaft next week if things don't improve." He leaned closer, lowering his voice. "You all right with them staying here, Viv?" "Sheriff, mentioned they've been leaving bodies behind in other towns." Before she could answer, a booming voice cut across the room. "Well now, ain't this a touching sight?" Blackwell called out, his red beard split by a mocking grin. "The whole town coming to check on the poor shaking widow." A tense silence fell across the saloon. Vivian kept her expression carefully neutral. As she continued serving, though her mind was racing through potential escalation scenarios and response options. Thomas Hawkins raised a hand, silencing his laughing companion with a sharp gesture. "Manners, Blackwell. We're guests in this establishment." His voice carried the polished edge of his former military authority. "Mrs. Harlow runs a fine place here, despite her affliction." The final word hung in the air, dripping with condescension. Vivian felt the protective anger rising from her regular patrons, these men who had declared themselves her unofficial guardians after her husband's death. She needed to defuse the situation before it escalated into violence they couldn't win. "More stew, gentlemen?" she offered, moving toward the Outlaws' table with deliberate calm. Her hands shook as she balanced the heavy pot, sloshing liquid dangerously close to the rim. "Careful there," James Hawkins smirked, moving his expensive boots away from potential spillage. "Be ashamed to ruin good leather because you can't control your hands." Vivian lowered her eyes in apparent submission, the perfect picture of a cowed woman accepting her limitations. Inside, Lieutenant Hayes catalogued James Hawkins' vulnerable points with cold precision, the exposed carotid artery when he tilted, his head back to laugh, the way he favored his right side, suggesting an old injury, the predictable location of his holstered weapon. "My apologies," she murmured, serving the stew without incident. "The tremors come and go." Thomas Hawkins studied her with unsettling intensity as she worked. Unlike his brother, whose cruelty came from simple sadism, Thomas possessed the more dangerous quality of genuine intelligence. Vivian could feel his assessment, sense him noting inconsistencies others might miss, the way her eyes scanned the room with tactical awareness, how her movements, despite the tremor, demonstrated economy of motion characteristic of military training. "Tell me, Mrs. Harlow," he said conversationally as she turned to leave, "did your husband serve before his unfortunate mining accident?" The question, seemingly innocent, felt like a trap. Vivian allowed her hands to tremble more visibly, buying precious seconds to formulate her response. "No, sir," she replied with carefully calibrated sadness. "Thomas wanted to join up during the war, but his lungs were weak from childhood illness. The mine was the only work he could find." "Thomas Harlow," Hawkins repeated, as though testing the name for authenticity. "Seems we share a name, though perhaps not a destiny." "Perhaps not," Vivian agreed softly, then seized the opportunity to gather intelligence of her own. "You gentlemen planning to stay long in Copper Canyon? Not much here to interest men of your experience." Carson, the nervous scout, snickered. "Oh, we found something mighty interesting already." Rodriguez elbowed him hard in the ribs, silencing. "The impending revelation." Thomas Hawkins smiled thinly. "We find something of value in every town, Mrs. Harlow," he said smoothly. "Copper Canyon won't be an exception." As the night progressed, Vivian maintained her role as the unassuming widow while observing the increasing integration of the Hawkins gang into her saloon. They drank heavily, but with calculated restraint, never allowing themselves to become truly impaired. They invited local miners to their table for cards, loosening tongues with free whiskey, while extracting information about the town's layout, schedules, and vulnerabilities. Most concerning was Thomas Hawkins' focused attention on Harold Williams, the bank manager who had been coaxed into joining their table and now sat sweating profusely as the conversation turned to the bank's operating procedures. "Just a small establishment," Williams was saying, tugging nervously at his collar. "Hardly worth your interest, Mr. Hawkins." "On the contrary," Thomas replied, refilling the manager's glass with expensive bourbon he'd produced from his saddlebag. "Small banks often hold surprising treasures. Mining payroll, for instance. When is the next shipment scheduled to arrive?" Vivian moved casually within earshot, wiping down a nearby table as Williams hesitated. "Monday," the bank manager finally admitted, his voice barely audible. "Wells Fargo coach brings it from Tucson. 5,000 in gold and notes." Thomas Hawkins nodded appreciatively. "Substantial for such a modest operation. And the sheriff's routine on delivery days?" He meets the coach at the edge of town, escorts it to the bank." Vivian's hands stilled momentarily before she forced the tremor to return. The Hawkins gang's plan was taking shape, a payroll robbery timed to exploit the town's limited law enforcement. With Deputy Collins away until tomorrow evening and Marshal Fletcher still tracking the gang's false trail, Sheriff Daniels would be alone on Monday. The Outlaws had chosen their target with tactical precision. By midnight, the saloon had mostly emptied, leaving only the Hawkins gang and a few drunken stragglers. Vivian had sent Clara, her part-time help, home hours ago, preferring to manage the dangerous guests herself. As she cleared tables and washed glasses, she maintained her facade of nervous exhaustion while her mind finalized contingency plans. Thomas. Hawkins approached the bar as she counted the night's earnings, his footsteps deliberately heavy to announce his presence. "Profitable evening?" he inquired, gesturing toward the cash box. "Enough to keep the doors open another day," Vivian replied, her hands trembling as she sorted coins. A few deliberately slipped through her fingers, scattering across the bar top. "Sorry," she murmured, fumbling to collect them. Hawkins caught one before it rolled off the edge, placing it precisely atop her pile. "Interesting condition, your tremor," he observed casually. "Most pronounced when you're being watched, I've noticed. Almost absent when you think no one's paying attention." Ice crystallized in Vivian's veins, but her expression betrayed nothing, beyond mild confusion. "The doctor in Tucson said it might improve with time," she offered, deliberately avoiding direct engagement with his observation. "What caused it, if I might ask? You mentioned a nerve condition, but those typically have specific origins." She hesitated, then offered a truth wrapped carefully in lies. "Trauma, they say. After the collapse that killed Thomas, I was the one who found him. The shock did something to my nerves." Thomas Hawkins nodded slowly, his eyes never leaving her face. "Trauma changes people in unexpected ways. Some break, others adapt." He leaned closer, his voice dropping. "I knew a soldier once during the war, shaking so badly from shell shock he could barely hold a cup. Yet, when we came under fire, those same hands were steady as bedrock on his rifle. Strangest damn thing I ever saw." Vivian kept her breathing, measured, her expression neutral. "The human body is mysterious, Mr. Hawkins." "Indeed it is, Mrs. Harlow." He straightened, the moment of intensity passing like a cloud across the sun. "We'll be riding out early to survey the countryside." "No, need for breakfast. We'll fend for ourselves." After the Outlaws retired to their rooms, Vivian completed her closing routine with methodical precision. She locked the front door, extinguished the lamps, and checked each window, all normal activities for a proprietor securing her establishment for the night. Nothing in her movements would have seemed unusual to anyone watching, but as she moved through the darkened saloon, Vivian was calculating sight lines and potential firing positions, mapping the building's tactical advantages and vulnerabilities. The window above the piano offered a clear view of the bank entrance 120 yards away. The rear staircase creaked on the fourth step, a natural warning system for anyone approaching from behind. The trapdoor to the cellar could be secured from below, providing both concealment and escape if necessary. In her private quarters behind the kitchen, Vivian locked the door and stood motionless, listening to the old building settle around her. Through the ceiling, she tracked the movements of her dangerous guests. James and Carson had taken the room closest to the stairs, their bootfalls heavy and careless. Rodriguez had the center room, his movements nearly silent but betrayed by the distinctive sound of a whetstone on steel. sharpening his knife for the violence to come. Blackwell's snores already rumbled from the end room. Thomas Hawkins occupied the largest room overlooking the street. His footsteps were measured, deliberate, a man conducting a thorough inspection of his surroundings. Occasionally, they paused near the wall that adjoined Vivian's concealed storage room, as though sensing something important hidden there. When the movements finally ceased, Vivian waited another 30 minutes, counting each second with military precision. Then she moved to her wardrobe, pushing aside dresses to reveal a small iron safe embedded in the wall. Her fingers, steady now in the privacy of her room, dialed the combination with practiced ease. Inside lay items no frontier widow would possess, military grade. Field glasses, topographical maps of the surrounding territory, marked with carefully plotted routes and distances, and a small, leather-bound journal with entries in a cipher of her own creation. Beneath these, wrapped in soft cloth, rested something even more incongruous, a Medal of Valor with Lieutenant Vivian Hayes's name engraved on the back. She removed the field glasses and maps, spreading the latter across her small desk. The Hawkins. Gang surveillance of the town today had confirmed her suspicions. They were planning to hit the bank during Monday's payroll delivery, then escape along the old mining road that led through Devil's Canyon to the territorial border. What they didn't know was that Devil's Canyon offered exceptional shooting positions for someone with Vivian's particular skill set. Positions she had already mapped and measured during nature walks over the past 3 years, preparing for contingencies she hoped would never materialize. An echo from her military training whispered through her mind, "Hope for peace, but prepare for war." Vivian hadn't survived 3 combat tours and a disastrous covert operation by relying on hope. She had survived by preparation, by thinking 3 moves ahead, by understanding her environment better than her enemies. Tomorrow would test whether 3 years of civilian life had dulled those instincts. From the street outside came the sound of approaching horses, too many for a casual late-night arrival. Vivian moved silently to the window, peering through a narrow gap in the curtains. 6 riders in the distinctive dark uniforms of the Arizona Rangers dismounted outside the sheriff's office across the street, their expressions grim in the moonlight. Marshal Fletcher had arrived with reinforcements. Vivian's heartbeat accelerated slightly, not from fear, but from tactical assessment. The Rangers' presence dramatically altered the strategic landscape. If Fletcher and his men moved against the Hawkins gang now, the saloon would become a battleground. Innocent lives could be lost in the crossfire. But if Fletcher was planning a dawn raid, Vivian needed to position herself to protect the townsfolk who would be caught between professional killers on both sides of the law. She made her decision. Quickly, efficiency born of combat experience. Moving to her bedside table, she removed a small Derringer pistol, the only weapon she kept openly in her quarters, a reasonable precaution for a widow living alone. It would serve as appropriate cover while she implemented her real strategy. The Hawkins gang had made a fatal error in choosing Harlow's Rest as their base. They believed they were wolves among sheep, never suspecting that their chosen flock contained something far more dangerous than any predator. A guardian with the patience to appear weak until the perfect moment to strike. Vivian checked her timepiece, 2:17 a.m. In less than 4 hours, dawn would break over Copper Canyon, bringing with it a confrontation that would shatter her carefully constructed identity. Lieutenant Hayes would need to emerge to ensure Vivian Harlow and the town she had come to call home survived what was coming. Her right hand trembled slightly as she set down the field glasses, the genuine symptom of nerve damage that had ended her military career. She focused, and the tremor subsided, not completely, but enough for what she needed to do. Steady, she whispered to herself, the word both acknowledgement of her physical limitation and reminder of her exceptional ability to overcome. it when necessary. Outside, the rangers led their horses to the livery stable, moving with the deliberate quiet of men preparing for conflict. Marshal Fletcher remained behind with Sheriff Daniels, their silhouettes visible in the lamplight of the sheriff's office, hunched over what was likely a map of the town. Two professional forces were now converging on Copper Canyon, neither aware that a third player was already in position, a player who knew this ground better than either of them, a player they all underestimated, and that would be their last mistake. Dawn painted the eastern sky in hues of amber and gold, silhouetting the jagged mountains that embraced Copper Canyon. Vivian stood on her rear porch, coffee mug trembling, in her right hand, while her left remained hidden in the folds of her apron, gripping the derringer. The morning air carried the mineral scent of dust and sage, along with something less tangible, the unmistakable tension before violence erupts. The Hawkins gang had departed before first light, their horses' hoofbeats fading toward the western hills. Blackwell had muttered something about scouting the terrain when Vivian encountered him in the pre-dawn darkness, his massive frame filling her kitchen doorway as she stoked the stove fire. The casual words belied their tactical purpose, establishing escape routes, selecting ambush positions, finalizing their approach to Monday's payroll robbery. Across the street, Marshal Fletcher's rangers maintained a careful watch from scattered positions throughout town, one lounging against the livery stable, another seemingly occupied with repairs to the water trough, two more taking breakfast at Clara's cafe with clear sightlines to the saloon's entrance. Their studied nonchalance might have fooled ordinary townsfolk, but Vivian recognized the disciplined positioning of men preparing for conflict. "Powder keg with a lit fuse," she murmured, sipping her coffee as her tactical mind calculated probabilities and outcomes. When, not if, these forces collided, Copper Canyon would become collateral damage. The creak of approaching footsteps brought her attention back to her immediate surroundings. Marshal William Fletcher himself rounded the corner of the building, his tall frame casting a long shadow across her small garden. At 50, Fletcher carried himself with the measured confidence of a man who had survived decades of manhunts and gunfights. His badge gleamed against the dark fabric of his coat, deliberately visible, a statement rather than an identification. "Mrs. Harlow?" His voice was unexpectedly gentle, at odds with the weathered face and gun-calloused hands. "Sheriff Daniels mentioned you might be able to provide some information about your current guests." Vivian allowed herself to startle slightly, the coffee sloshing in her cup as her tremor intensified. The performance came naturally after 3 years of practice. "Marshal Fletcher," she acknowledged, her voice appropriately subdued. "I wasn't expecting visitors this early." Fletcher removed his hat, a gesture of courtesy that hinted at an upbringing more refined than his current profession suggested. "Apologies for the intrusion, ma'am. May I join you for a moment?" She gestured to the bench beside her, maintaining the persona of a widow whose greatest excitement was serving drinks to dusty miners. "Coffee's fresh if you'd like some." "Much obliged," Fletcher said, settling beside her with a careful distance that respected propriety. "Sheriff Daniels thinks highly of you, Mrs. Harlow. Says you've been a cornerstone of this community since your arrival." The subtle probe wasn't lost on Vivian. Fletcher was fishing for background, trying to establish who exactly was harboring the territory's most wanted outlaws. She offered her practice story, the narrative she had crafted and reinforced countless times over 3 years. "Copper Canyon was my husband's hometown," she explained, her trembling hands cradling her coffee cup. "After he died in the mine collapse, there was nowhere else for me to go. The townspeople were kind enough to help me convert his family's old property into the saloon." Fletcher studied her face, his experienced eyes searching for inconsistencies. "It's unusual for a woman alone to run such an establishment, especially in a frontier town." "Necessity breeds adaptation, Marshal," Vivian replied, allowing a flicker of genuine truth to color her words. We all do what we must to survive. Indeed we do, Fletcher agreed, his gaze shifting toward the distant hills where the Hawkins gang had disappeared. Those men staying with you, they're dangerous criminals, Mrs. Harlow. They've left a trail of bodies across 3 territories. 2 lawmen dead in Silver Springs last month, a family in Diablo Creek before that. Vivian's expression registered appropriate horror, though none of this information was new to her. Her intelligence gathering over the past 24 hours had already constructed a comprehensive profile of the Hawkins gang's methodology and escalating violence. I had no idea, she whispered, the perfect picture of a sheltered widow confronting harsh realities. They've been intimidating, certainly, but I never imagined. You're in a difficult position, Fletcher acknowledged. I'm not here to judge your circumstances, but I need to know anything you've observed, their routines, conversations, plans, anything that might help us apprehend them without turning your establishment or this town into a battlefield. The irony wasn't lost on Vivian. Here sat a lawman asking for tactical intelligence from a woman he perceived as a helpless civilian, never suspecting he was speaking to someone whose battlefield experience likely exceeded his own. They've been asking questions about the bank, she offered, allowing her voice to tremble with apparent fear, particularly about Monday's payroll delivery, the timing, the security, the amount. Fletcher's expression tightened, confirming her assessment. As we suspected, did they mention specific plans, timing, approach routes? They're careful about what they say around me, she replied. But I've overheard mentions of Devil's Canyon as an escape route. This information, while accurate, was deliberately incomplete. Vivian was engaged in a delicate balancing act, providing enough intelligence to establish credibility while withholding details that might compromise her own developing strategy. Fletcher nodded thoughtfully. Devil's Canyon would be a strategic choice. Narrow passages, high walls, limited approach routes, easy to defend against pursuit. His eyes narrowed slightly. You seem quite familiar with the local terrain, Mrs. Harlow. I walk the hills when my hands are steady enough, she explained, deflecting his subtle suspicion. The solitude helps. Thomas taught me to be observant of my surroundings. Fletcher studied her for another moment, then abruptly changed tactics. You have military experience, don't you? The question, seemingly random, was precisely calculated to provoke a reaction from someone with something to hide. Vivian recognized the interrogation technique. She had used it herself during her time. With Army intelligence, she allowed genuine surprise to register on her face before answering. Me? Heavens no, she replied with a soft laugh, though my father served briefly during the early conflicts with Mexico. Why do you ask? Just an impression, Fletcher said, backing away from the direct confrontation. You have an awareness about you that reminds me of soldiers I've known. Perhaps it's just the vigilance of a woman alone, Vivian suggested. We develop certain instincts for survival. Before Fletcher could pursue this line of questioning further, a commotion from the main street interrupted their conversation. Raised voices, the rapid approach of hoofbeats, a woman's frightened cry. Vivian rose instantly, her body responding with combat readiness before she could modulate her movement to match her cover identity. Fletcher noticed. She saw the quick assessment in his eyes, but there was no time to correct the error. Around the corner of the building came James Hawkins, dragging Clara by the arm, his expression twisted with cruel amusement. Behind them followed Carson, leading their horses and glancing nervously over his shoulder. One of Fletcher's rangers lay sprawled in the dust of the street, blood spreading across his shirt from what appeared to be a knife wound. Well now, James called out, his voice carrying the dangerous edge of a man looking for excuse to inflict violence. What have we here? The trembling widow entertaining the law while we're away. His grip tightened on Clara's arm, causing the older woman to whimper. Found this one telling tales to the rangers at her cafe. Fletcher's hand moved toward his holstered revolver with professional smoothness. "Release the woman, Hawkins." "I don't believe I will, Marshal," James replied, pressing his knife against Clara's throat. "Not until you explain why you and your men are crawling all over our temporary home like ants at a picnic." The standoff crystallized in an instant. Fletcher, poised between duty and the hostage's safety, James Hawkins seeking any provocation to escalate violence, Carson fidgeting with nervous energy that made him unpredictable. In the background, Vivian noted movement as the remaining Rangers responded to their colleague's injury, creating a rapidly deteriorating tactical situation. 3 years of peaceful existence in Copper Canyon had not dulled Lieutenant Hayes's crisis assessment capabilities. In the fraction of a second, while James's attention remained fixed on Fletcher, Vivian's trembling right hand disappeared into her apron pocket, while her steady left smoothly extracted the derringer. "James," she said, her voice transformed from the widow's soft tones to something altogether different, commanding, authoritative, the voice of someone accustomed to being obeyed in life-or-death situations. "Release Clara immediately." The change was so dramatic that all 3 men turned to stare at her, momentarily forgetting their standoff. In that instant of confusion, Vivian raised the derringer, her left hand perfectly steady as she aimed directly at James Hawkins's right eye. "I won't miss at this distance," she stated flatly, "and this little gun makes a surprisingly large hole." James froze, recognition dawning in his eyes as he processed the transformation before him. The trembling, apologetic widow had vanished, replaced by someone whose stance and expression conveyed absolute deadly capability. "Who the hell are you?" he whispered, the knife wavering slightly against Clara's throat. "Someone who values this." "Untown and its people," Vivian replied, her aim unwavering. "Let her go, back away slowly, then ride out while you still can." Perhaps it was the absolute certainty in her voice, or the unnaturally steady hand holding the weapon, but James Hawkins, a man who had murdered without hesitation across 3 territories, slowly lowered his knife and released Clara's arm. "This ain't over," he growled, backing toward his horse. "Thomas will want to hear about this." "I'm counting on it," Vivian replied coldly. As the 2 outlaws mounted and galloped away, Clara collapsed into Vivian's arms, sobbing with relief and confusion. Marshal Fletcher stood frozen, reassessing everything he thought he knew about the widow Harlow. "Get inside," Vivian instructed Clara gently, helping her toward the saloon's rear entrance. "Sheriff Daniels will come for your statement soon." When they were alone again, Fletcher fixed Vivian with a penetrating stare. "That was quite a transformation, Mrs. Harlow. Or should I call you by another name?" Vivian sighed, tucking the derringer back into her pocket. The tremor returned to her right hand, though less pronounced now that part of her cover had been compromised. "Vivian Harlow is my legal name," she replied carefully. "The rest is complicated." "Military," Fletcher said, not a question this time, but a statement of fact. "The way you handled that weapon, your stance, the command presence. Army?" She neither confirmed nor denied, instead focusing on the immediate tactical situation. "James will report to Thomas what happened here. That changes your timetable considerably, Marshal." Fletcher studied her face, professional curiosity warring with operational necessity. "You're right. We can discuss your complications after we deal with the Hawkins gang." He paused, then asked directly, "Can you shoot? Really shoot, I mean?" For the first time since arriving in Copper Canyon, Vivian allowed Lieutenant Hayes to show clearly in her expression. "Better than anyone you've ever met." Even with the tremor, she raised her left hand, holding it rock steady. "I adapted." Fletcher nodded slowly, coming to a decision. "I need every capable gun. The Hawkins gang has terrorized this territory long enough. My involvement comes with conditions, Vivian stated firmly. This town and its people remain protected at all costs. No civilians in the crossfire. Agreed, Fletcher said without hesitation. But I need to know who I'm working with, at least the essentials. Vivian considered her options, calculating the risks of partial disclosure against the potential benefits of Fletcher's cooperation. 3 years of careful anonymity weighed against the immediate threat to the community she had come to call home. Lieutenant Vivian Hayes, she said finally, formerly Army Special Operations, sniper instructor with 3 combat tours before. She held up her trembling right hand. Afghanistan. Shrapnel damaged the nerves. They wanted to put me behind a desk. I chose retirement instead. It wasn't the complete truth, but it contained enough verifiable facts to satisfy Fletcher's immediate concerns while omitting the classified details of her final mission and the circumstances of her disappearance. Fletcher whistled softly. The Army lists you as killed in action. The Army made assumptions based on incomplete information, she replied carefully. I didn't correct them. And Thomas Harlow, the mining accident? Necessary constructs, Vivian acknowledged. The tremor is real enough, though its cause wasn't grief. Fletcher absorbed this information with professional detachment. Your secret's safe for now, Lieutenant. We have more pressing concerns. Together, they moved toward the saloon's main room, their conversation shifting to tactical planning as they assessed maps spread across one of the tables. For Vivian, the transition felt both foreign and familiar, stepping back into the role she had abandoned 3 years ago while applying those skills to protect her new identity rather than discard it. Thomas Hawkins was Confederate cavalry during the war, Fletcher explained, tracing potential approach routes on the map. Specialized in lightning raids behind Union lines. That experience informs his current methodology: quick strikes, minimal exposure, predetermined escape routes. Vivian nodded, her tactical mind already processing this information against known terrain features and the gang's observed behavior. He'll adapt his plan now that James has exposed our awareness of their target. The payroll robbery itself may be abandoned in favor of a direct confrontation. Agreed. He can't leave witnesses who can identify them, especially law enforcement. Which means they'll either strike at your rangers directly or use the town as leverage, Vivian concluded. Either way, civilian casualties become their acceptable collateral damage. Fletcher's expression darkened. I've seen their work. They'll burn this town to the ground if it serves their purpose. Vivian's mind had already raced ahead to potential contingencies. We need higher ground. Devil's Canyon offers the best defensive positions, but they'll be expecting us there now. We need alternatives. She indicated several key positions on the map, locations she had mentally catalogued during her walks over the past 3 years, places suited to her particular skills, shooting positions that would allow her to control the approaches to town while remaining virtually invisible to anyone below. The old mining office on the North Ridge, she explained, 800 yards from the main road with clear sightlines to both approach routes, minimal exposure, maximum coverage. Fletcher studied the position with professional appreciation. Can you make that shot? 800 yards is well within my effective range, Vivian interrupted calmly. My record is 1,235 yards in Helmand Province. Confirmed. The marshal fell silent, reassessing her capabilities. You really were Quicksilver Hayes, he said finally. You're in the training manuals now. The shot that couldn't be made. Vivian's expression remained impassive, though something flickered in her eyes at the mention of her former callsign. The past is irrelevant. What matters is using those skills now to protect this town. As they continued planning, a clatter of approaching hooves announced Deputy Collins's return from the Peterson ranch. The young lawman burst through the saloon doors, his expression wild with alarm. "Marshal! Sheriff Daniels sent me to warn you. The Hawkins gang has taken hostages at the church. They're demanding your rangers leave town immediately or they'll start executing townsfolk." Fletcher turned to Vivian, his expression grim. "Looks like they're forcing our hand sooner than expected." "No," Vivian corrected, already moving toward her private quarters. "They're making their first critical mistake. Consolidating in a fixed position gives us the initiative." She disappeared into her room, emerging minutes later transformed. Gone was the modest apron and simple dress of the widow Harlow. In their place, practical canvas trousers tucked into worn leather boots, a dark shirt beneath a fitted vest with multiple pockets. Around her waist, a gun belt with twin Colts positioned for a left-handed draw. Most striking was her bearing, the slightly stooped posture and tentative movements completely replaced by the assured efficiency of a combat veteran. From a leather case, she withdrew her disassembled Sharps rifle, her left hand moving through the assembly process with practiced precision, while her right provided support where it could. Fletcher watched in fascination as the trembling hand that had served drinks for 3 years now participated in the deadly ritual of preparing a weapon designed for one purpose, taking human life at extraordinary distances. "Deputy," Vivian instructed, her voice carrying the natural authority that had once commanded elite soldiers. "Return to Sheriff Daniels. Tell him to evacuate all civilians from the south side of town immediately. Use the mine tunnels if necessary." Collins stared, struggling to reconcile this commanding figure with the trembling widow who had poured his whiskey for years. "Mrs. Harlow, Lieutenant Hayes," she corrected, checking the rifle's action with smooth efficiency, "and we don't have much time." As Collins departed, still bewildered by the transformation, Fletcher asked the question that had been forming since her revelation. Why Copper Canyon? Of all places to disappear, why here? Vivian paused in her preparations, her expression momentarily distant. Because it needed protection more than it needed another war hero. Because sometimes the best way to heal isn't medals and parades, but quiet service to people who see your value beyond your abilities. She slung the rifle across her back, her eyes focusing on the distant church spire visible through the saloon window. And because sometimes, Marshal Fletcher, the most effective guardian is the one no one recognizes until the moment they're needed most. Outside, the sun climbed higher in the Arizona sky, burning away the morning shadows as Copper Canyon held its collective breath. The Hawkins gang had unwittingly awakened something they couldn't possibly understand, a ghost from battlefields they had never seen, a protector whose trembling hands became deadly instruments when wrapped around the stock of a rifle. Lieutenant Vivian Quicksilver Hayes was about to reclaim her reputation, one precision shot at a time. The white steeple of Copper Canyon's modest church pierced the cloudless sky, its weathered cross casting a long shadow across the dusty ground. From her position atop the abandoned mining office, Vivian lay perfectly still beneath a sun-bleached tarp, the Sharps rifle an extension of her body rather than a separate tool. 812 yards separated her from the church, a distance she had measured precisely during her ascent, using landmarks and terrain features as reference points. Through her field glasses, she observed the scene with cold detachment, her tactical mind processing every detail. The Hawkins gang had chosen their position with surprising sophistication. The church offered limited approaches, all exposed to clear lines of fire. Its stone foundation provided natural cover, while the wooden structure above created effective concealment. Most critically, the 27 hostages, including the pastor, his family, and various townsfolk who had been preparing for Sunday services, were positioned against the windows, creating human shields against any direct assault. Thomas Hawkins stood on the church steps, his aristocratic bearing and calm demeanor masking the predatory calculation beneath. Beside him, James paced with barely contained violence, still visibly agitated from his earlier confrontation with Vivian. Inside, Blackwell and Rodriguez guarded the hostages, while Carson maintained a lookout from the bell tower, his nervous energy finally channeled into a useful purpose. The standoff had reached its third hour. Marshal Fletcher and his rangers maintained a perimeter at a respectful distance, their positions offering the illusion of containment while actually providing minimal tactical advantage. Sheriff Daniels moved between concerned townspeople, his weathered face set in grim determination, as he coordinated the evacuation of non-combatants from the potential field of fire. "Situation report." Fletcher's voice crackled through the field telegraph that connected their positions, an ingenious adaptation of military communication technology that Vivian had suggested during their hasty planning session. 5 targets. "Confirmed," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper, though the sound, amplifying copper cone, would carry it clearly to Fletcher's receiving unit. "Primary in the open, secondary on steps, 3 inside with hostages. Minimal movement past. 20 minutes. They're waiting for something. Or someone," Fletcher suggested. "Our intelligence indicates they may have additional men arriving. Former Confederate irregulars Thomas served with during the war." This new information altered the tactical calculus significantly. Vivian adjusted, her position slightly, easing pressure on her left elbow where it braced against the rough wooden planking of the rooftop. "Timeline?" she asked, her tone revealing nothing of the concern this development caused. "Unknown. But the longer this standoff continues, the more likely their reinforcements arrive." Vivian's mind raced through contingencies, discarding and reformulating plans based on this new variable. In Afghanistan, she had faced similar scenarios. Time-sensitive operations complicated by the potential arrival of enemy reinforcements. The solution then, as now, required decisive action rather than prolonged negotiation. "We need to force their hand," she concluded. "Create an opportunity for the hostages while neutralizing the leadership." "Agreed," Fletcher replied, his voice tight with tension. "But how? Any direct approach would put civilians at risk." Vivian's gaze shifted to the church bell tower where Carson maintained his nervous vigil. The young outlaw represented the weak. Link in the Hawkins gang's otherwise disciplined operation, jumpy, inexperienced, prone to impulsive decisions. "I can take the spotter in the bell tower," she said after a moment's consideration. "Clean shot, minimal risk to hostages. His elimination creates a blind spot in their security perimeter." And then, "Confusion," Vivian replied simply. "When leadership loses situational awareness, they make mistakes. We capitalize on those mistakes." Fletcher's silence conveyed his professional assessment of the strategy, risky but potentially effective. Finally, he responded, "I'll position the Rangers to exploit any opening. Your call on timing, Lieutenant." Vivian settled deeper into her, firing position, making minute adjustments to her stance and breathing pattern. The Sharp's rifle, though antiquated compared to the weapons she had used in Afghanistan, possessed qualities uniquely suited to this environment: exceptional accuracy at long distances, devastating stopping power, and most importantly for her current needs, a distinctive report that would be difficult to immediately locate in the canyon's acoustics. The tremor in her right hand had not disappeared. Nerve damage couldn't be overcome through willpower alone. But through years of adaptation and practice, she had developed techniques to compensate. Her left hand provided primary stability and trigger control, while her right offered secondary support during the firing sequence. The result wasn't the perfect ambidextrous capability she had once possessed, but as her instructors had drilled into her from the beginning, perfect isn't required, effective is. Through her field glasses, she observed a subtle shift in the Hawkins gang's positioning. Thomas had moved closer to James, their heads inclined toward each other in urgent conversation. Carson leaned farther out of the bell tower, scanning the surrounding hills with increasing agitation. "They're getting nervous," Vivian reported. "Something's changed in their timeline." As if confirming her assessment, Thomas Hawkins raised a brass speaking trumpet to address the rangers maintaining the perimeter. "Marshal Fletcher," his voice carried across the distance with practiced authority, "my patience expires with the sun. You have 1 hour to withdraw your men completely from Copper Canyon, or we begin executing hostages." The ultimatum crystallized. Vivian's decision matrix. The Hawkins gang was accelerating their timetable, which meant either their reinforcements were approaching more rapidly than anticipated, or they had recognized the tactical vulnerability of their position. Either way, the window for effective intervention was closing. "Marshal," she said into the telegraph, "prepare your men. I'm taking the shot." Vivian set aside the field glasses and pressed her cheek against the smooth wooden stock of the Sharp's rifle. Through the precision scope, a custom modification she had made during her idle hours as a saloon keeper, she focused on Carson's agitated form in the bell tower. The distance was substantial, but well within her capabilities. The environmental variables, temperature, humidity, slight crosswind from the west, had already been calculated and compensated for in her sight adjustment. The afternoon sun cast no problematic shadows or glare from this angle. All that remained was execution. Vivian drew a measured breath, held it halfway, and allowed her consciousness to narrow to a single point of focus. In this state, which her military trainers had called combat clarity, extraneous sensory input faded to background noise. Her heartbeat slowed. The tremor in her right hand stilled not through force of will, but through the body's recognition of a task for which it had been exquisitely trained. She exhaled slowly and squeezed the trigger with her left index finger. The Sharp's rifle bucked against her shoulder, its report echoing across the canyon in rolling waves that bounced from stone, walls and cliff faces, creating the audio illusion of multiple shots fired from various directions. Through her scope, Vivian observed Carson's body jerk backward, then disappear from the bell tower opening. The elimination of their lookout created precisely the confusion she had anticipated. Thomas and James Hawkins dove for cover behind the church steps while Blackwell appeared briefly at the front door, his massive frame silhouetted against the interior gloom as he tried to determine the direction of the shot. "Bell tower neutralized," Vivian reported calmly, already working the rifle's action to chamber another round. "Second target acquiring." Below, Fletcher's rangers responded with coordinated precision to the pre-arranged signal. 2 men created a diversion at the southern perimeter, drawing attention with concentrated fire, while 3 others advanced from the east behind improvised moving cover, a tactic Vivian had suggested based on her experiences with urban warfare. Thomas Hawkins recovered quickly from the initial confusion, his military training evident in how rapidly he assessed the changing tactical situation. Through her scope, Vivian watched him gesturing to James, clearly communicating a contingency plan they had established prior to the confrontation. This quick adaptation confirmed Vivian's assessment of Thomas as the primary threat. His leadership was the cohesive element that made the Hawkins gang effective rather than merely dangerous. Removing him from the equation would dramatically reduce their operational capability. She shifted her aim, tracking Thomas as he moved in a crouching run toward the church doors. The shot was more complex now, a moving target partially obscured by structural elements with hostages potentially in the background. This was the type of high-stakes engagement that had earned her the call sign Quicksilver during her military career, the ability to make near-impossible shots under extreme pressure. Vivian inhaled, measured her heartbeat, and began the mental countdown that preceded perfect trigger control. 3, 2, a sudden flash of movement in her peripheral. Vision broke her concentration. Through years of combat experience, she recognized the telltale signs of a flanking maneuver. Someone was attempting to circle behind her position. In one fluid motion, Vivian rolled away from her firing position, simultaneously drawing one of the Colt revolvers from her belt. Her movement came not a moment too soon. A rifle shot splintered the wooden planking where she had lain seconds before. Rodriguez, the silent member of the Hawkins gang, had somehow identified her location and maneuvered to eliminate the threat she posed. His tactical acumen matched his reputation. This was no common outlaw, but a disciplined combatant with impressive fieldcraft. The confrontation shifted instantly from long-range precision to close-quarters survival. Vivian took cover behind a ventilation housing as Rodriguez fired again, the bullet ricocheting off metal with a high-pitched whine. She calculated angles and approaches, noting that her position offered limited defensive options but excellent awareness of potential assault routes. Rodriguez would need to cross 10 yards of open rooftop to reach her current position. That exposure presented an opportunity. Change of situation, she reported tersely into the Telegraph. Engaged at my position. Maintain operation timeline. She didn't wait for Fletcher's acknowledgement. Rodriguez was already moving, using the minimal cover available on the rooftop with impressive efficiency. Vivian holstered her revolver and retrieved a smaller weapon from her boot. A derringer similar to the one she had used earlier, but modified for increased accuracy at short ranges. When Rodriguez made his final approach, believing he had pinned down an enemy focused on the church scenario, Vivian was ready. As he rounded the ventilation housing, confidence evident in his aggressive stance, she fired twice in rapid succession from an unexpected angle. The first shot caught him in the shoulder, spinning him sideways. The second struck center mass, the impact driving him backward across the rooftop. He collapsed without a sound, his rifle clattering away across the weathered planking. Vivian verified the neutralization with clinical detachment, then immediately returned to her primary firing position. The engagement with Rodriguez had cost precious seconds, during which the situation at the church had evolved significantly. Thomas Hawkins had used her diversion to implement his contingency plan. Through her scope, Vivian observed with cold clarity as he positioned James at the church entrance with 3 hostages, Clara among them, while he himself retreated toward the rear of the building where horses waited. The tactical intent was clear. James would serve as rear guard, sacrificing himself if necessary to ensure Thomas's escape with select hostages who would provide continued leverage during his withdrawal. It was a sound strategy under the circumstances, one that played to their respective strengths. James's capacity for violence and Thomas's long-term strategic thinking. In military terms, a classic extraction under pressure with acceptable asset expenditure. But Thomas Hawkins had made one critical miscalculation. He had designed his exit strategy against conventional opposition, lawmen who would prioritize hostage safety over target elimination. He hadn't accounted for facing a combat-hardened sniper whose specialization was exactly this type of high-stakes engagement. Vivian reacquired her firing solution, adjusting for the new target position and environmental variables. Thomas Hawkins was now 842 yards distant, moving in a diagonal pattern toward the church's rear exit. The shot was complex. Moving target, crosswind factor increasing with distance, potential hostage positioning unknown once he reached the exit. This was the moment where Lieutenant Vivian Hayes had always excelled. Where others saw impossible variables, she perceived solvable equations. Where conventional doctrine dictated caution, she recognized opportunity. Her right hand trembled against the rifle stock, the permanent reminder of her injury. But as she settled into position, the tremor subsided. not through miracle or wishful thinking, but through the profound muscle memory developed across thousands of training repetitions and combat engagements. Vivian drew a measured breath, calculated trajectory against movement, and applied pressure to the trigger with precise control. The Sharps rifle's report echoed across Copper Canyon once more. Through her scope, she observed Thomas Hawkins stumble mid-stride, clutching his leg where her bullet had struck with surgical precision. Not a kill shot, but a perfectly placed disabling wound that shattered his femur. He collapsed behind a water barrel, temporarily shielded from further fire, but effectively removed from the tactical equation. His elimination created exactly the leadership vacuum Vivian had anticipated. At the church entrance, James Hawkins reacted with visible confusion, his hostage leverage suddenly compromised by uncertainty. In his moment of hesitation, Fletcher's Rangers executed their coordinated assault, breaching the church from multiple angles, while James was fixated on his brother's fall. The operation resolved with clinical efficiency after that. Blackwell surrendered when confronted with overwhelming force inside the church. James attempted resistance, but was wounded and captured by Fletcher's men. Carson had died instantly from Vivian's initial shot, and Thomas Hawkins, the brilliant tactician and ruthless outlaw leader, found himself lying in the dust outside Copper Canyon's church, surrounded by rangers with their weapons trained on his immobilized form. From her elevated position, Vivian observed the resolution with professional detachment. The hostages were being escorted to safety. The rangers were securing their prisoners. Sheriff Daniels was organizing townspeople to assist the wounded. Her participation was no longer required. With practiced efficiency, she disassembled the Sharps rifle, returning each component to its specialized case. She gathered her observation, equipment, removed all evidence of her position, and prepared for extraction. Lieutenant Hayes's brief re-emergence was complete. It was time for the widow Harlow to return. As she descended from the mining office via a rarely used trail that would conceal her approach back to town, Vivian felt the tremor returning to her right hand, stronger now after the physical and mental demands of combat. She didn't fight it. The tremor was no longer merely a limitation to be overcome, but an integral part of her carefully constructed identity. In Copper Canyon, people would soon be talking about the mysterious sharpshooter who had saved their town from the infamous Hawkins gang. Speculations would abound about who had made the impossible shots from the old mining office. Some would credit Fletcher's Rangers with exceptional marksmanship. Others might suggest a guardian angel watching over their community. No one would suspect the trembling widow, whose hands shook too badly to reliably pour whiskey without spilling, and that, Vivian reflected as she approached the outskirts of town, where normality would need to be reassumed, was precisely the point. The perfect disguise isn't one that draws no attention, but one that draws the wrong kind of attention. Her trembling hands had never been a liability. They had been her most effective cover. The very limitation that had driven her from military service had become the foundation of her new life. As she neared Harlow's Rest, Vivian stored her rifle case in a concealed location she would retrieve later. She adjusted her clothing to appear appropriately disheveled for someone who had been hiding from danger. She deliberately emphasized her tremor as she prepared to rejoin the townsfolk who would be gathering to discuss the day's dramatic events. Lieutenant Vivian Quicksilver Hayes receded once more beneath the carefully constructed persona of Vivian Harlow, the widow whose hands trembled too badly to pose any threat to anyone, except when they didn't. The aftermath of violence settled over Copper Canyon like dust after a storm, gradually, inevitably, coating everything in its residue. By sunset, the church had been cleared of all evidence of the hostage crisis, save for a single broken window and bullet-scarred doorframe. The Hawkins gang had been transported to the county jail in Tucson under heavy guard, their notorious reign of terror across the territory finally ended. Citizens emerged from their homes cautiously at first, then with increasing confidence as news of the gang's capture spread. They gathered in small groups on the boardwalks, their conversations a mixture of relief, excitement, and the peculiar exhilaration that follows narrowly avoided tragedy. At the center of this hurricane of activity stood Harlow's Rest, its lanterns glowing warm welcome in the gathering dusk. The saloon had transformed from potential battleground to impromptu community center, its tables filled with townsfolk, seeking both liquid courage and collective comfort after the day's events. Vivian moved among them with practiced ease, her hands trembling visibly as she served whiskey and coffee. She had changed into a simple blue dress with a fresh apron, her hair hastily pinned back in its usual practical style. To anyone watching, she appeared exactly as she had for the past 3 years. The widow Harlow, perhaps more shaken than usual by the day's violence, but fundamentally unchanged. Only the most discerning observer might have noticed subtle differences, how she positioned herself with consistent sightlines to all entrances, the way her gaze periodically swept the room in a pattern that assessed potential threats, the momentary steadiness of her left hand when passing items with precision rather than casual indifference. "Another coffee, Sheriff?" she asked, approaching the table where Daniels sat with Marshal Fletcher and 2 of his remaining rangers. The others had departed with the prisoners, leaving Fletcher to conclude the operation and file the necessary reports. "Please," Daniels nodded, his weathered face showing the strain of the day. "And perhaps something stronger to accompany it." Vivian poured both coffee and whiskey with carefully modulated trembling, allowing a few drops to spill on the tabletop, a performance for any watching eyes. "Sorry," she murmured, dabbing at the spill with her apron. "My hands aren't what they used to be." Fletcher watched this display with quiet assessment, his expression revealing nothing of their shared secret. Since their return to town, he had maintained a respectful distance, allowing Vivian to reassume her civilian identity without complication. His only acknowledgement of their alternate relationship had been a single nod when they first re-entered. The saloon, professional recognition of a mission successfully completed. "Mrs. Harlow," he said now, his tone casual, "the Rangers and I will be departing tomorrow morning. I wanted to thank you for your hospitality during our stay." "You're most welcome, Marshal," Vivian replied with appropriate modesty, "though I suspect Copper Canyon owes you a far greater debt than you owe us." The carefully structured exchange allowed both participants to navigate the complex reality beneath their public personas. Fletcher had questions, dozens of them about her identity, her history, her choice of Copper Canyon as refuge, but he respected the operational security her continued cover required. "I've been meaning to ask," Sheriff Daniels interjected, "did anyone ever figure out who made those shots from the mining office?" "Wasn't one of your rangers, was it, Fletcher?" The Marshal sipped his coffee before answering. "The territory has many skilled marksmen, Sheriff. Some prefer to remain anonymous after rendering assistance." "Well, whoever it was saved a lot of. Lives today," Daniel said, raising his glass, "to guardian angels, wherever they may be." The assembled patrons echoed the toast with enthusiasm, glasses raised toward the ceiling in general tribute. None noticed how Vivian's trembling hand momentarily steadied as she listened, her expression betraying nothing of her internal response to this unknowing acknowledgement. As the evening progressed, the celebration gradually transformed into something more reflective. Miner Hank Peterson played sad, sweet melodies on the old piano in the corner. Clara, recovered from her ordeal as hostage, distributed fresh-baked bread from her cafe. Reverend Simmons offered a simple prayer of thanksgiving that even the least religious among them bowed their heads to receive. Vivian observed these rituals, of community healing, with a complex mixture of emotions she had not permitted herself to fully experience during her years of military service. There was professional satisfaction in a mission successfully executed, certainly, but something deeper had taken root during her time in Copper Canyon, a sense of genuine belonging rather than tactical positioning, of protecting people who mattered to her rather than strategic assets assigned value by distant command. The tremor in her right hand, once a liability that had ended her military career, had become the foundation upon which she had built a life worth defending. A paradox that would have amused her former commanding officers, no doubt. As midnight approached and the townsfolk gradually departed for their homes, Fletcher remained at his table, clearly waiting for an opportunity to speak privately. Vivian acknowledged this unspoken request with a subtle nod as she cleared glasses and wiped down tables with methodical precision. When the last patron had gone and Sheriff Daniels had departed for final rounds, she locked the front door and turned. The sign to closed. Only then did she approach Fletcher's table, coffee pot in her trembling hand. "One for the road, Marshal," she offered, filling his cup without waiting for response. Fletcher watched the precisely controlled tremor with professional appreciation. "That's quite the performance you've maintained, Lieutenant. 3 years without breaking character. Most operatives would have slipped eventually." "I'm not most operatives," Vivian replied simply, setting down the pot and taking the seat opposite him. "And I told you, Vivian Harlow is my legal name now." "So it is," Fletcher agreed, studying her face in the lamplight. "Your file makes for interesting reading. Distinguished service, multiple commendations. Then Afghanistan, an operation gone wrong and officially listed as killed in action when you disappeared during medical transport." Vivian's expression remained neutral, though her eyes sharpened slightly. "You've been thorough in your investigation, Marshal. I make it a point to know who I'm working with," Fletcher replied. "Particularly when they demonstrate the kind of skills you displayed today." A moment of silence stretched between them. Not uncomfortable, but weighted with unspoken questions. Finally, Vivian sighed, her public persona dropping away like a discarded garment. "What do you want to know, Fletcher?" she asked, her voice shifting to the more direct cadence of Lieutenant Hayes. "Why?" he asked simply. "Why fake your death? Why Copper Canyon? The Army listed you as their most promising female sniper instructor. You could have had any posting you wanted, disability accommodation included." Vivian's left hand, the steady one, traced patterns in a water ring on the wooden tabletop, her gaze distant as she formulated her response. "Have you ever been the only survivor of an operation gone catastrophically wrong, Marshal?" Fletcher nodded slowly. "Once. Border incident in 71. Lost 4 good men to an ambush." "Then you understand the questions that follow, the investigations, the debriefings, the subtle implications that perhaps you survived because of something you did or failed to do." Her right hand trembled more pronouncedly now, not as performance but from the genuine emotion that accompanied these memories. "Afghanistan, Helmand Province, 8-person special operations team sent to eliminate a high-value target. Intelligence said minimal opposition. Intelligence was wrong." Her voice remained steady, despite the tremor in her hand. "We walked into a trap, coordinated ambush from multiple positions. I took shrapnel to the right arm and shoulder when the first RPG hit, severed nerves, damaged muscles." Fletcher remained silent, allowing her to navigate the difficult terrain of memory at her own pace. "I was separated from the unit during the initial confusion. By the time I regained consciousness and worked my way back to the rendezvous point, everyone was dead, all 7 teammates." She met Fletcher's gaze directly. "I eliminated 14 hostiles during my extraction. Made it to the secondary pickup point with the mission intel intact. Sounds like exemplary performance under extreme conditions," Fletcher observed. "Why would that lead to suspicion?" "Because I was the only survivor," Vivian replied simply. Because someone had to bear responsibility for a mission gone wrong based on faulty intelligence. Because it's easier to question the combat effectiveness of a female operative than to acknowledge systemic failures in intelligence gathering. Understanding dawned in Fletcher's expression. The injury provided an honorable exit. The injury provided a convenient excuse, she corrected. Nerve damage to my shooting hand meant I could be removed from field operations without official censure. They offered me a training position, teaching others while subtle investigations continued. Into the Helmand failure, Fletcher nodded slowly. So you disappeared instead, during medical transport in Germany, created documentation for Vivian Harlow, widow, relocating after personal tragedy. Chosen because it was close enough to my real name that I'd respond naturally, different enough to avoid easy connection. And Copper Canyon? A hint of genuine emotion softened Vivian's expression. Needed somewhere remote, somewhere I could observe approaches, somewhere people minded their own business. She gestured around the saloon. The tremor made the perfect cover. No one suspects the woman who can barely pour coffee without spilling of being capable of precision shooting. Fletcher absorbed this information with professional detachment, though something resembling respect flickered in his eyes. Your secrets are safe, Lieutenant. The official report will credit Ranger Marksman with the resolution of the hostage situation. Appreciated, Vivian acknowledged. But that doesn't explain why you're still here, Marshal. Report filed. Prisoners transported. Case closed. Her eyes narrowed slightly. Unless there's something else. Fletcher reached inside his coat and withdrew an official-looking envelope, placing it on the table between them. This arrived by telegraph while you were positioned at the mining office. Army intelligence requesting information on a possible sighting of interest in the Arizona Territory. Ice crystallized in Vivian's veins, though her expression betrayed nothing. Specifically? Reports of a woman matching certain physical characteristics operating a business in the southeastern region. No name attached to the inquiry. Just a list of identifying features and behavioral patterns consistent with specialized training. Vivian's mind rapidly assessed this new information, calculating probabilities and contingencies with cold precision. The Hawkins situation will have drawn attention. Reports filed, names recorded. None mentioning Lieutenant Hayes or her specific contributions, Fletcher assured her. I've been careful about that, but there's more to consider. He tapped the envelope with one finger. This inquiry predates today's events by approximately 2 weeks, meaning someone was already looking before the Hawkins gang arrived. Someone remembered something, noticed something, reported something. The implications were clear. Vivian's carefully constructed cover identity had developed a leak somewhere. Not catastrophic yet, but potentially compromising given enough time and attention. I see, she said finally, her voice neutral despite the strategic calculations racing through her mind. Thank you for the information, Marshal. Fletcher studied her face, clearly recognizing the shift from conversation to operational planning. What will you do? For a moment, Vivian's gaze drifted around the saloon, the scarred wooden bar she had polished daily for 3 years, the mismatched chairs that had supported the weight of miners and cowboys and ordinary townsfolk, seeking momentary respite from harsh lives. The piano in the corner where Hank played melancholy tunes that somehow made everyone feel less alone. Traditional protocol would dictate immediate relocation, she said finally. New identity. New territory, clean extraction before confirmation can occur. Traditional protocol, Fletcher noted, but not necessarily your protocol. A ghost of a smile touched Vivian's lips. 3 years ago, I would have been gone by morning. No trace, no forwarding address, no emotional attachments to complicate operational security. And now? She considered the question carefully, acknowledging the fundamental shift that had occurred within her during her time in Copper Canyon. The Trembling Widow had begun as tactical cover, but somewhere along the way, aspects of Vivian Harlow had become as genuine as the combat-hardened Lieutenant Hayes. Now, she said slowly, I find myself weighing factors beyond tactical advantage. Fletcher nodded with understanding that transcended their professional connection. You've built something here, something worth defending. Perhaps, Vivian acknowledged, though sentiment makes for poor strategic planning. Does it? Fletcher challenged gently. Your performance today suggests otherwise. Your connection to this community sharpened your focus rather than compromising it. You made tactical decisions based on protecting civilians that ultimately led to mission success. He gestured toward the window beyond which Copper Canyon lay peaceful in the desert night. Sometimes the best cover isn't just a constructed identity, it's genuine integration. These people trust Vivian Harlow not just because she plays the role convincingly, but because over 3 years she has become exactly who they needed her to be. The observation struck closer to truth than Vivian had permitted herself to acknowledge. Her training had emphasized maintaining emotional distance from cover identities. They were tools to be discarded when compromised, not lives to be genuinely inhabited. But Copper Canyon had changed that calculus in ways she hadn't anticipated when selecting it as her refuge. The Trembling Widow had found more than safety here. She had found purpose beyond survival. I'll need to make adjustments, she said finally. Increase security protocols, identify potential intelligence leaks, prepare contingencies. But you're staying, Fletcher concluded, satisfaction evident in his voice. Vivian's trembling right hand stilled momentarily as she placed it flat on the table, a physical manifestation of the decision crystallizing within her. For now, she qualified professional caution reasserting itself. With enhanced awareness of potential compromise, Fletcher nodded, recognizing this as the most definitive commitment a person with her training could make. He stood, placing his hat on his head with a gesture that signaled the conclusion of their conversation. One last question, Lieutenant, he said, pausing at the door. Do you ever miss it, the uniform, the mission, the certainty of purpose? Vivian considered the question with the honesty it deserved. Sometimes, she acknowledged, but today reminded me that the skills remain even when the uniform doesn't. The training, the focus, the capacity to act decisively when required. She looked around the empty saloon, seeing not just the physical space, but the community it represented, the lives, interconnected with her carefully constructed existence. And I've discovered that purpose can be found in unexpected places, she added. Sometimes protecting a single town can matter as much as any classified operation. Fletcher touched the brim of his hat in a gesture of respect that acknowledged both the soldier she had been and the protector she had become. Safe harbors, Lieutenant Hayes. Safe trails, Marshal Fletcher, she replied, the formal exchange of final acknowledgement of their shared understanding. After he departed, Vivian moved methodically through her closing routine, checking locks, extinguishing lamps, securing the cash box in its hidden compartment beneath the floorboards, each action balanced between the practiced efficiency of Lieutenant Hayes and the careful, trembling movements of the widow Harlow. Both were real now. Both were necessary. In her private quarters, she removed the formal army recognition of Lieutenant Vivian Hayes's service. Medals, commendations, the documentation of a life officially ended, from their hiding place and studied them in the lamplight, not with nostalgia but with clear-eyed assessment of the path that had led her to this moment. The tremor in her right hand would never fully disappear. The nerve damage was permanent, a constant reminder of sacrifice and survival. But what had begun as career-ending injury had transformed into the foundation of a new existence. one that paradoxically offered greater security precisely because of its perceived vulnerability. No one suspicious of a highly trained military operative would look twice at the widow, whose hands shook too badly to reliably fill a coffee cup. The very limitation that had driven her from service had become her most effective disguise and, ultimately, her greatest strength. Vivian returned the mementos to their hiding place and moved to the window, looking out over the sleeping town of Copper Canyon. Tomorrow, the saloon would open as usual. She would serve drinks with trembling hands to miners and cowboys and townspeople who had no idea that their lives had been saved by those same hands. And when, not if, future threats appeared on the horizon, the trembling widow would once again transform into the steady-handed protector, moving between identities with the precision that had once made her the army's most promising sniper. The tremor would come and go, as it always had. But Vivian Harlow and Lieutenant Hayes would remain steady in purpose, if not always in hand. After all, as she had learned through hard experience in both war zones and frontier towns, true strength rarely came from the parts of oneself that never wavered, but from the ability to remain effective despite the tremors that life inevitably brought. And on that frontier, where past and present collided, Vivian had found not just refuge, but home. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.